So as Judy said, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm so happy to be here with you guys. As she mentioned, we met before this whole quarantine and COVID thing was a thing. And she's so organized. She had this calendar mapped out for months, which is really impressive. By the way, In-N-Out Burger, I mean, what a cool event. I think everyone's going to want to come do that. I want to do that. But we did have this planned out for many months. And so now we're doing it over Zoom, obviously. And as you can tell, I'm not an expert on Zoom. I have been doing telehealth since March. So been doing lots of interactive computer work, but just, you know, shout out if there's something that's not clear over Zoom, or if you can't see something that I think you can see. And I'm happy to try to tweak it. But right, so I'm a clinical psychologist. I've been working for many years focusing on autism. Started grad school back in 2003 and had worked even before that in autism. And over the years, really sort of developed an interest, and I guess you could say a specialty, in working with teens and young adults and older adults. And with that came this idea of really understanding depression, anxiety, and the things that tend to go along with autism, just as they go along with many other things. And so with that in mind, I give you that background because dating is not necessarily a specialty of mine. In fact, in real life, I hated dating. I don't know how many of you guys enjoy dating, and if you do, that's wonderful. I found dating really confusing and hard, and so I think my husband thinks it's funny that I sometimes give talks on dating. But it's something that has become really relevant in working with people on the spectrum. And actually what I'm going to start off with talking about is that there is actually a little bit of research about that too, and why this can be particularly important. But I do want to just put it out there that most people find dating nerve-wracking. There's a lot that you put into dating or relationships. So you're putting forth a lot of energy and emotion. You don't always get that back. It's not always an investment where you get the return. A lot of people find it frustrating and nerve-wracking and just really kind of confusing. But we do it. Most people do it, or they have a motivation to do it because the end result can be so rewarding. So that's kind of the big picture that I see. So with that, I'm gonna just kind of start by taking some steps back, just to sort of define some terms, and what is it that we're talking about. So what is dating? What does that mean? So dating sometimes meant something a little different in pre-COVID times, right? And I've talked to some friends going through dating right now to try to get a sense of, you know, what, and sorry, is this is the chat up here. Can everybody see the chat if I click on it? That's okay. Hopefully, I don't know.
Not necessarily.
Is that okay for me to click on then? Because I don't want to miss questions. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to check to see. Okay. So if you do, I'm okay, by the way, with pausing at certain points and having some questions or dialogue. If there's something that's not clear, feel free to put it in the chat. So dating is a bit different now in the age of COVID, right? So we'll try to address that as we go, but hopefully this is a temporary thing. But what is dating, right? How is this different than a friendship? It means being romantically involved with somebody. It's seeing somebody with a purpose, right? You usually, not always, but usually when people date, it's because they have a goal in mind that they want to develop a relationship. There are some people that date just to date, but I think usually it's because there's sort of like an end goal in mind to develop a relationship. Usually before COVID, dating entailed leaving the house to go somewhere with somebody. And obviously this has shifted a little bit. One of the things that can be a little bit confusing about dating is that, the activities, so what we do want to date is the same as what we might do when we socialize with friends, but the thoughts and feelings, our intentions, are what differentiate a date from friendship, right? So what that means is we're going into it with the perspective of, oh, could we develop a romantic relationship out of this? And so even though it might be that you're playing miniature golf or you're going for coffee, just like you would with a friend, the thoughts and feelings behind it are what make it different, or what make it a date. And that can be confusing too, because sometimes people aren't on the same page about that because the activities are the same. One person might think it's for as friends, the other person might have a romantic interest, and sometimes it's hard to know the difference if we can't read people's thoughts and feelings, because nobody has X-ray vision to really know what people are thinking about, right, on these dates. But usually this means spending time with the hopes of leading to a committed relationship. And again, that's an assumption. That's not always the case. But for the purposes of this talk, we're going to talk about it in terms of developing a relationship. There's been lots of research on dating per se that has nothing to do with autism, that has, you know, and there are relationship experts out there. And so when I tried to learn about this, there was some agreement that there are stages of dating. So the first would be this general attraction, right? So you see someone, you're attracted to them. Maybe this is online, maybe this is in person, but there's like a spark that people talk about, or physical attraction. I see there are some comments or questions. I'm just going to check in. Okay, they're about the slides. Number two is uncertainty. So this is a big one, and it's what a lot of people don't like about dating. This is the stage where you don't know what everybody's intentions are. Does the other person interested? How much do I like this person? Do I want this to go far? Do I not want this to go far? Are they dating other people? Do I want to date other people at the same time? So this is a time of like a lot of angst sometimes when people are trying to go through the stage. Number three would be exclusivity. This is if you actually have a conversation with someone and say, okay, we're just dating each other and we're not dating other people. Intimacy refers to not just physical intimacy, but also emotional intimacy. So really getting to know someone on a deeper level. And then 5 is engagement, if that's the route that you're going, right? If the end game is engagement and marriage, which it doesn't have to be. But this is what, you know, some of the research has kind of landed on. So I'm not going to focus on this a lot, sexual development, other than a couple of take-home points here. So first of all, just kind of going down the bullets, if you go down several bullets, taking place within context of family, culture, and community. So what we're talking about today is going to differ in different families, right, in different cultures. Years ago, I taught a class at UCLA. It was an extension program for folks going through a pathways program, it was called. And so there was a range of different developmental disabilities and diagnoses in this program, but all were kind of gearing toward transitioning to college, or they were in the early stages of college classes. And I taught a class on relationships, and it ended up being quite a bit of sex education. And what came up in this course, which makes total sense, is that a lot of people had different levels of knowledge based on their family and culture. There were some families that didn't feel comfortable talking about this and hadn't really educated their adult child about it. Sometimes that's out of fear, right? That if they're educated about it, then it'll make them experiment more, but you know, that's not necessarily the approach to safe sex and being safe. But to respect, this is important when we are talking about dating too, that when you go on a date with someone, people are coming from different cultures and different communities where there are different expectations about dating. And so sometimes that's an important conversation to have, you know, in terms of how their family views dating and relationships and marriage. And sex too, by the way, that comes up in terms of, you know, different cultures and families and individuals in terms of if they think they want to have sex before marriage, if that's a priority or not. All of those things don't come up on a first date, but later on over the course of dating. One of the things that can be tricky, and this might not be relevant for this group, but I see it among the sort of more of like the range of different folks that I've worked with, that physical maturity, that takes place on its own, right? Hormones develop in people's bodies. It has nothing to do with cognitive, intellectual, social, emotional development. It sort of goes on its own course. And sometimes that maturity happens before maybe parents feel like their child is socially or emotionally ready to engage in sex and dating. So this is a confusing disconnect sometimes. It's, again, different for every family and individual, but it's something that comes up a lot. You know, puberty happens early sometimes, and it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's able, or not able, that somebody is even interested in or ready for dating and what comes with that. Sorry, I was trying to see if there were any chats. So in the research in ASD, and again, I'm not going to spend the whole time on research. I think it's important to just give a little bit of a foundation. The bottom line here is there's not a lot of research. So we have small sample sizes, which means there haven't been big groups of people on the spectrum who have given information about this. And when there has been research and researchers say, hey, come do our study, we want to learn about romantic relationships and sexuality and sexual experiences, you can imagine that the people drawn to those studies, they might actually be people who are more interested in this or have more experience in this. So there might be some bias in the data that we do collect. So we're still learning about what's out there in the research. And so lots of what I'm going to talk about is more from anecdotal experience, just in terms of working with folks and hearing from them, and not necessarily based on all the research, because there isn't much out there. I would be remiss if I did not mention sexual orientation and gender identity. I am not an expert on sexual orientation and gender identity development or gender dysphoria, but I am trying to learn more and more about this, because so many of the clients or patients that are referred to me, so many of the young adults are questioning their sexuality, have been questioning their gender. Some are going through gender transitions. And we're seeing more and more of this, and probably because people didn't feel comfortable reporting it before. We also just see generally higher rates in the autistic population than we do in the general population. We see this especially among women. The rates across studies, they vary, again, given the difficulties we have with research. But we see really high rates not only of experimenting with bisexuality, but also, again, with gender dysphoria. There are a lot of different theories about this that I'm not going to necessarily get into unless people have specific questions about this or want to talk about it. But I have to, again, it would be remiss not to mention, much of when we talk about first dates and relationships, we're talking about male-female dates, and that's not necessarily the norm, right? But that's what a lot of the research is based on, and what we base some of our conclusions on, which probably isn't a fair representation of what's actually going on. There are, yeah, I'll come back to this later if people have questions, but I'm, like I said, I'm not an expert on it, but I'm trying to educate myself by consulting with people who are experts. And I'm actually learning a lot from my clients these days, because so many of them are dealing with this right now. Oh, there's the chat. Let me just check and see if there's any chats. Okay. Okay.
And Lindsay, I can keep a watch on the chat.
That would be great.
About it, and I'll let you know if there's a question that.
Thank you. I just want to make sure, because I'm happy to stop if there is one.
I will let you know, but I don't want to ruin your flow here. So.
Oh, that's okay. I know we have a lot of time too. So, okay. So getting used to how the buttons work on here. So there's a lot of misconception, I think, about sexuality and dating in autism. And when you look at the years, when you see studies that are published, right? So like this one is 2017. Keep in mind that to publish a paper takes usually a few years of writing, of getting feedback, of getting decline from journals, resubmitting it. Collecting data in a study takes a few years, if not several years. And sometimes when there's a longitudinal study, when we're following teens or children through teenage years, adulthood years, these are a lot of years. And the point in me explaining that is when you see like 2017, that doesn't mean that that data is current, right? It's usually a reflection of the data from several years ago, which is unfortunate in research unless someone really gets research out quickly. But we're finding, and this is obvious, right, that adults do desire and pursue sexual relationships, even though earlier on there was this view of asexuality, maybe that people on the spectrum were asexual and not desiring relationships. I have never found that to be true, but that was a misconception or an assumption that was made early on. And I think because of that, there really is limitations in terms of the research and knowledge that we have. I mentioned that one of my areas that I've done a lot of work in is in depression and anxiety. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that relates to romantic relationships. Desire and motivation is not the same as initiation and maintaining a relationship, right? So someone might have a lot of desire and motivation and a hard time maintaining a relationship or getting into a relationship. That disconnect can lead to a lot of feelings of loneliness and depression, right? So if someone really has this strong desire and motivation to be in a relationship, feeling like it's really difficult to do that, feeling left out, right? Watching some of their peers get into relationships, watching their experiences, of course, now in the age of social media, people are watching people post pictures and making everything just look like butterflies and rainbows, which is not always what a relationship is. This can lead to a lot of feelings of loneliness and even depression and isolation, feeling like there is that disconnect. There is some evidence, again, these studies are from now well over a decade ago, but of higher incidence of inappropriate courtship and sexual behavior. And this is something that I do want to talk a little bit about. Let me see what my next bullet is. So I think I'll talk a little bit more about this later on too, but this is something I have run into clinically working with a number of clients and young adults, sort of not knowing sometimes that they have come across as being a little bit too focused or like relentless in their behavior and trying to pursue somebody. And we will talk more about this later on in the talk. I don't think that this is something that's done on purpose. I think that sometimes this has to do with being really fixated on something and maybe not realizing how somebody else is perceiving that fixation. So we do see that happen. And sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear background. I do have kids here, like way down the hall. So you might hear them fussing out there. They're with someone, don't worry, I didn't leave them alone. ASD individuals who are in relationships with another ASD individual report more satisfaction than those with a neurotypical partner. Again, there's not a lot of data about this, so I would maybe take that with a grain of salt, but I found it was interesting and I threw it in there anyway. So one of the reasons why, and this is probably a biased opinion that I'm going to give you guys, I think that sex education is very important. That's not always consistent with people's cultural, religious beliefs, but everybody is, you know, susceptible to the same sexual health risks as anybody else. And so not having knowledge or understanding of that can put somebody in a position of being potentially in a dangerous situation. I see that there are a bunch of chats. Judy, is everything, are there any specific questions?
Yeah, well, there's some commentary. Andrew is kind of expressing the frustration about being a male and having the role from society,
Yeah.
the initiator.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some folks wondering if we were still on the same slide, sexual and romantic interest in ASD, and I think we are, just basically going through the research. So
yeah, gender norms, totally true. Yeah, I'm just reading through them too. Yeah, and that's true. There is sort of an old school expectation. It's not always true though. I think that that's changing about women sort of initiating and making the first move. Yeah, but it's true that oftentimes that responsibility falls on the male, and it just doesn't always feel fair that that's the case. Yeah, especially in the beginning. I certainly think that once someone's in a relationship, that tends to even out, but when it's a male-female relationship that we're talking about, yeah, I think that's sort of like, that's a complicated topic, because I think a lot of people want that to change, but there's something sort of built in about that where we still fall back on those same patterns. I just want to compare dating to friendships, and there actually is some data on this, and I'll speak personally to some data that I was privy to about this. And this is, maybe I shouldn't have called it disadvantages of adult friendships for people. Basically, the take home of this is that friendships are really confusing too, right? So I'm talking about how dating can be confusing. We also find that in adulthood, and this goes across the board, that meeting new friends as adults is hard. I kind of joked about this when I moved to a new city with my husband and we had a baby. We would like go to the park and try to meet other parents, and it was really awkward. When it's built in school or a program where you have constant contact with people, or you're on the same track doing something, sometimes that's a little easier. Making friends as adults can be hard, and there are not clear guidelines and expectations for it. So what I mean by that is, we don't always know how often it is okay to call somebody, right? How often are we supposed to text someone? How much information do we divulge? If we have an interest, which friend do we call and ask if they want to go with us to engage in that interest? Friendships in adulthood are kind of murky. And how much information do we disclose to them? And so this is something that actually there are some advantages to having a romantic relationship where those sort of guidelines and expectations are a bit more clear. And I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything with the chats, because I do want to.
There are some chats here, so you're going to want. I would make it to this slide and then respond. There's some commentary on personal experience.
Okay. Oh yeah, I was on the same slide. Are the slides lined up with what I'm talking about today?
Yes, we're following there. I think it was that one person might have been following along differently. So what I would do is make it through the slides, and then let's kind of maybe pause for a second and have
Sure, that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, so that's basically the take home of this slide. And let me just see what the next one. Yeah, so that's kind of leading into this next idea about why romantic relationships can actually be advantageous. Oops. So I'll try to be quick. Oh, now I lost where the chat is.
It's okay. Why don't I share with you some of the thoughts
here? That would be great. Okay.
So one other person is just talking about even online, there's some thoughts on online dating, that even online, it seems like the man has to make the first move. Steve recommends taking a dog for a walk is a good way to meet lady.
That's a great idea.
And Martin shared his personal experience when he was in high school. He wanted to date, and so he asked some girls out. He was turned down. They said they had boyfriends, and it made him feel embarrassed. So he felt like, well, he should have asked them if they already had a boyfriend first. So he was kind of confused at the order. I just want to say, Martin, life is a lot of mistakes. So dating's no different, but I'll let Lindsay answer.
Yeah, no, it's true. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically in a few minutes about the process of dating. But that, I mean, one of the hard things about dating is how vulnerable we are, and especially for a male in that situation, right? Feeling like you have to ask somebody out, you're putting yourself out there, and there's a lot of rejection in dating, and there's a lot of feeling vulnerable and feeling like we misstepped. And it's really rough. And so it's true with dating, when it comes to asking somebody out, it's always good if you can do a little recon, right? If there's any way to get, like, if it's online, that's different. But if it's someone in person, to kind of ask around if somebody has a significant other. I always recommend asking somebody out when there aren't other people around. So at least if it's embarrassing, it's only embarrassing between the two of you and not other people. But that's a common experience, and it's just really tough. Yeah. So one of the things, yeah, go ahead.
Well, we'll finish up these set of
Yeah.
chats, and then you can move on. George comments that Aspies have trouble making friendships in the first place, so this is like yet an extension of it. And then Karen points out that she read on Wrong Planet that an Aspie relationship can either work out really, really awfully or really great. So, depending on interest and needs.
I think that that's totally true. And that first comment about making friends is hard enough, absolutely. And that's why this is extra tricky, because again, like I started off saying, most people find dating tricky, right? So it's sort of about being willing to take these risks and being vulnerable, knowing that if there's an end result, if it works out, it could exceed expectations and maybe even be better than having a few acquaintances or friendships that are not so deep. So it's true, making it through that hurdle of getting into a relationship is so tricky. And we'll talk more about those specifics and some tips. So is that the gist of the comments for? Okay.
We're ready to move on.
Okay. Yeah. And feel free, I'm learning as I go too. And like I started off saying, I'm not an expert in dating, and those who call themselves experts in dating, more power to them, because I just think this is a very challenging part of life. Yeah. In fact, I'll tell you guys, I got married when I was 33, which is fine. I was working on my PhD and everything before that, but that means I went through a lot of years of feeling like I was the single one and dating when other people were coupled up, lots of discouragement. And it's a tough process. So, you guys are not alone if you feel like this is just discouraging and tough. A lot of people feel that way until they're in a relationship, and then they're like, oh, there's so many advantages to being in a relationship. That's why I put all that time in and went through all those hardships. But you're not alone in feeling like it's really tricky. Some of the advantages of being in a romantic relationship for people on the spectrum is that they're actually, once you're in a relationship, these cultural scripts, and what I mean by that is what's expected in a relationship can actually be a little bit more clear, right? So as I mentioned, friendships, it's hard, right? Like, oh, I want to go see this movie. Who do I call? Have I called them too many times? Am I giving them enough notice? Do they like this movie? Or, oh, this really difficult thing happened to me with my family. Do I want to disclose that to someone else? Is that too much information? Who can I tell that to? It's really murky, right? When you're in a committed romantic relationship, that's your person, right? So sometimes it's a little bit more clear. You certainly, once you make it past those initial dating phases, you certainly can confide in them. That is that you want to do together. So in some ways, this cultural script can be more clear when you're in a romantic relationship. It's also a source of social and emotional support. This is someone who kind of can get you and can help cheer you on when something positive happens. Hopefully this is someone you can share some activities with. I will say I think there's a lot of emphasis on shared interests in friendships and in romantic relationships. I think that that's very important. But there's more to it than that too. It's really shared values, shared outlook on life, shared sense of humor, right? I don't necessarily like doing all the activities that my husband does. I don't really love watching football. I mean, I'll tolerate it, right? But it's more that we have a similar worldview about things, and you don't really know that until you get to know someone. So in the beginning, it's those shared.
Karen's
Okay.
Karen's commenting about the biological changes before the psychological readiness. And there's a reason why there's a whole genre about personality and emotional clashing. I don't. Oh, someone wanted to know how you and your husband met.
Yeah.
And
I will talk about that.
And David said he met his girlfriend when he was 22. And Steve is talking about meeting his wife online.
Wow. And I love that. I'm reading it too. He said, I kept telling myself, I'm only looking for one. That's so true. Yeah. Okay, I'm just kind of skimming through. So yeah, so you guys were asking how my husband and I met, right? So yeah, we met online actually, and I was saying when the internet went out that you can't tell because I'm sitting down, I'm about 5'10". So one of my biggest criteria was somebody taller than me. So I actually emailed him, and that's how we met. And it wasn't necessarily super smooth. We talked, we met, then we didn't talk for a few months, then we talked again. So for me, dating was super confusing. We still talk about it, where I'm like, where did you disappear to for a few months? But everyone's at different stages in their lives when they meet someone. And so even if you feel like you really click with someone, sometimes that person is not in the same stage. So it's very tricky. So going back to the slide about sort of thinking about why there are so many advantages to being in a relationship. When I was at UCLA, there was a graduate student who was actually doing her dissertation on dating and attraction and young adults on the autism spectrum, and I was the clinical supervisor. So I supervised a speed dating event with her, and we did some focus groups together, and it was really illuminating. We had adults come in, some were in relationships and some were not, and these are some of the quotes from that focus group. So one was going back to what I said about the friendships. I mentioned that it's very time consuming, so I'd rather have one really close friend than a bunch of people who are trying to be my friend. Another one said, I want someone that I can actually feel close to. I don't really have any use for acquaintances. I don't like artificial relationships. And so this idea that being in a committed relationship, a romantic relationship, is really more fulfilling than having like 5 people that you're kind of friends with. As far as the data, I'm going to just kind of quickly go through so we can get more to the tips and things like that. But there's basically data. It's reflecting what you guys are even saying in the comments, that friendships are difficult. I hope this is getting better over time because, oh gosh, someone's trying to call. Because I think that there's more opportunities like Judy's providing, right, where there's more opportunities to meet. But also a lot of data showing low rates of romantic relationships among people on the autism spectrum. I have to say, though, that I don't think this is an accurate reflection. I think I am meeting a lot of people in my practice, in my clinical practice, for example, who are in their mid-40s and their 50s, who have been married, have children, and are coming to the realization that they're on the spectrum and seeking a diagnosis. So I don't think it's possible to get an accurate rate of the number of people on the spectrum who are in relationships, because we don't have an accurate rate of people who are on the spectrum. So now let's talk a little bit about being a good dater. This is so much easier said than done, right? So this is not supposed to be easy, but we can go through some of the tips. I'm gonna check the chat again. I hope that didn't throw off my internet again. I just wanna make sure I'm not missing any.
There had been some comments. There were some questions on online dating and what are some good sites. There was some commentary on, did people have dating coach 100 years ago? And I made a comment about arranged marriages.
Yeah, I used to wish that. I was like, oh, I wish someone would just arrange one for me.
And then more commentary on personal experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and the nervousness, I saw a comment about nervousness, so common. Oh, I used to get so nervous before dates too. And it makes sense. You're meeting someone new, you don't know what to expect. It's, yeah, we'll talk about that too. So this is kind of like general information on being a good dater, okay? So, and we'll talk more about these things specifically. So one is picking the right place. You don't want to pick a place that's so noisy where you can't hear anyone. You might want to pick a place you've been to before, right? So you kind of know the ins and outs, you know what to expect there. One thing that I'll mention a few times probably, I always think a first date especially should be short. I think that something like coffee, not dinner and a movie, because what if you're not having fun after like 10 minutes, right? You can always extend a date, but it's really hard to cut a date off in the middle. Being able to go with the flow, so hard, right? So this is not something that someone should just be able to snap their fingers and know how to go with the flow. It's more the expectation that things can change. Somebody could cancel, somebody could be late. You could get to a restaurant and then they say, oh my gosh, I'm vegan, I can't eat this. Is there another suggestion, right? And when it comes to dating, we have to kind of anticipate that things might not go the way we predicted or anticipated or even hoped. Dating more than one person, I always thought this was hard, but a lot of people give the advice that if you're talking to more than one person online, maybe even going on first dates with more than one person, maybe you have the attitude where you can kind of take it a little bit lighter and not put so much attention into one date. Ask questions the other person will love to answer. That means asking questions about them. People usually like to answer questions about themselves, but nothing too personal, right? So this is like things like, so where are you from? What do you do for work? Have you been here before? So you're getting to know the person, but you're not delving too deep right away. Be interesting and be interested. So, and I'm going to talk more about this, about what does that actually mean to be interesting. Sometimes we have to fake it. Be aware of body language. And this is another person's body language and your own. So on a date, if you're sitting like this and kind of have your head to the side, it might make it seem like you're not interested, even though for you that's just more comfortable. If you're talking and talking and talking and you notice the other person is turning their body or kind of looking away, right? You want to be aware of that and maybe stop talking and ask a question, for example. Be aware of how you present yourself. You should certainly present yourself as you. You shouldn't pretend to be anything other than you. But usually people put their best foot forward on a date. You want to make sure your clothes are clean, for example. And I'll give you more examples of that. And eye contact, which I'm going to talk more about that too, because that's easier said than done. I'm seeing
okay, there are some comments here. There was some people who had experience where someone would accept a date with them and then they'd flake out.
Oh my gosh, the worst. Yeah.
And also some advice that Martin had been given was, you should be friends with someone first before you ask them out on a date. So.
Oh, you know, that depends, because sometimes people are on a dating site with the intention of dating, right? And there isn't necessarily time to form a friendship. You can talk to that person and say, I like to take things slow, and maybe kind of be friends first. But I think that happens more organically when you meet somebody like not online, maybe in a group of friends and you get to know them first. It's great advice. It's nice to be able to do that. I think it doesn't always work like that, because if someone has the intention of dating, then, you know, when you go on a first date, you're kind of already on that track, like if you met somebody online. Okay, so I'm just kind of going through some of these.
Steve has some pointers here about not revealing yourself too much too soon.
Yeah, exactly. So let me see what I have next on here. Yeah, so this is a tricky one, right? So tricky, because I do have a couple video clips. I'm a little bit worried about the internet and everything and kind of rocking the boat, but maybe we'll see at the end. Such a good point and a good comment to make, because in dating, it's all about intimacy, and you know, we talk about like letting these walls come down, which means kind of letting people in to really understand who we are, but not on the first date, right? Sometimes it can scare somebody away when we reveal too much personal information. That kind of, it feels like TMI, right? So it's not that you should hide anything about yourself, because you should be who you are. It's more that, and I find this even in friendships too, where a lot of people kind of wonder about this boundary of how much information to share, how much to reveal. I always say to test it out, right? Like you can give a little bit without giving the whole story, right? So imagine if like you have a scar and something traumatic happened to you and somebody asks about your scar. You could say something like, oh yeah, it's a long story. It was kind of, you know, personal. I'm happy to tell you more at some point. And if the person says, oh, I would really love to hear more, maybe that's your invitation to give like another tidbit. But you don't have to give the whole story. You can gauge by seeing if they ask more and if they seem interested. So, and the same thing about asking questions that are overly personal, right? Like on a first date, you probably wouldn't say, so, how many people have you slept with? Right? Like that, you might want to know that, and that might be relevant to ask later, but to ask that on a first date, someone might be like, whoa, that's really personal, right? And you don't know each other yet well enough to do that. So sometimes it's good to take the other person's lead too. If they ask you a question, you can ask them the same question in return, because you know that's a safe topic. You say when asked for information.
Okay, yeah. So some people want to know about good sites for meeting people. There was some discussion about dating multiple people. Dating more than one person at a time helps weed out very insecure or very wounded people who take it as disloyalty to them. Nicholas is suggesting, would you say when asked for information, start with general statements, only get specific on request? Like I read a genre, and if they express interest or curiosity, follow up with a more specific question?
Yeah, I think even in general, when it comes to friendships, that's great advice, right? It's always good to kind of like give a lead, give a little bit of information, and then wait to see if somebody says, oh my gosh, me too, or I love to read, what are you reading? And kind of let it flow that way. If we have this mindset that we have to get all of the information out at once because there's something we want somebody to know, we're not taking the time to make sure that they want to know all the details. So I think that's great advice.
And I think another point, Lindsay, is that if you do too much talking without asking a question and make it too one-sided, that can be not the best dating technique.
Right.
So then there were some questions about the percentage of people who on the spectrum who have not been in relationships before, 66 to 100%. Said you wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
A question about do's and don'ts. Is there a list of do's and don'ts?
So great point about the percentage. I see that someone pointed out it wouldn't surprise you if the majority of the people were male. And the older the study is, the more likely that there are majority males in the study, because now people are not great, but getting better at recognizing females, and before, studies included mostly males. So that's a great point. And then do's and don'ts. I'm going to talk more specifically about tips for dating. So I'm going to elaborate on what this slide is. And then pressure from family and the person you're dating. Yeah. You know, this is hard because you have to go at your own pace. And oftentimes there is pressure, but usually if you are really comfortable with the relationship, it won't feel as much like pressure, right? Because it's something you're going to want to. Okay, so you guys could teach this to me, right? These next couple of slides. This is what I've learned from other people. But what do we think can make dating specifically difficult for someone on the spectrum? And you guys have already brought up some of this stuff. But I did mention this idea of these sort of fixations, right? So one of the most wonderful things, and I was just talking about this with a client today, is this idea of persistence in autism. And I love this. It's how people get things done. It's how they discover things. It's how they solve problems. It's this quality of being very persistent, right? So this is a good thing. But when it comes to a romantic interest, and sometimes we call this a love fixation, this can get a little bit blurry, because somebody, and I've dealt with clients who have unfortunately had this experience of becoming so fixated on someone, their intentions are really maybe sweet, right? Their intentions are to get to know the person more. Then maybe they become frustrated because it's not reciprocated, and so they try more. I've had a client show up at somebody's front door, call 50 times within the span of a few days, text multiple times over and over again because they're not getting an answer, because they're so fixated on the other person and wanting that response. And as you can imagine, that's not always perceived as being a positive thing. So, and in fact, it can be interpreted as even being somewhat like stalking behavior if it's not reciprocated. So this can be difficult, and it can also be difficult to when there's rejection, right? When you become so focused on something and then it's not reciprocated, maybe after a first date, that can be really hard. I've also even talked to a client who has talked about how it's hard to change course if you're actually physically intimate with somebody, and then the woman in this case changed her mind, and having to sort of change course, right? So this is something that can be really tricky for everybody, but I think particularly for people on the spectrum. You know, you guys have already mentioned in the comments that this difficulty reading context and social cues is hard anyway, a lot of times, like even in friendship. So how are we expected to do this on a date, right? And so this is something where it means really practicing and becoming aware of some of these hints. Like, how do we know if someone wants to be friends versus a date, right? So if someone is kind of like repeatedly touching or leaning forward, talking about hanging out again, those are good signs that the person is really interested. But what's tricky is that sometimes people are really friendly in order to be polite, and maybe they're not so interested in a second date. And that can be really confusing. You know, you guys mentioned online dating already in the chat, and this is a double-edged sword, meaning there's pluses and minuses to this. I think that on the surface, it's very attractive to say, oh, there's an online mechanism for people to meet, right? How great. Because I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to have these awkward flirtations. Like, who knows how to flirt? That's so hard, right? But at least online, here are some matches, and you can message and email them. So on the one hand, it's great. On the other hand, messaging is really confusing too, because you get no hints about the person's tone of voice, whether they're joking, whether they're being flirtatious. You really have to read between the lines. So this can be tricky too. So on the one hand, I think it's a great opportunity because there are there's more of a population, there's more people online. On the other hand, sometimes that messaging is tricky too. Small talk, oh my gosh, I know so many people, spectrum or not, who just don't like small talk. I get bored of small talk. My husband kind of makes fun of me because we'll go to, when we used to do things before COVID, I think I just find it kind of exhausting sometimes to make small talk. And I really like to get to know people and I like to meet people, but sometimes a small talk is like, it's draining for a lot of people. We don't always know what to say and what to talk about. And the first date especially is full of small talk. So sometimes it's nice to think of some things ahead of time, maybe like a really funny short story, like of a funny thing that happened to you early that day or the day before, or something interesting, or something that just happened, you know, not like political on the news, but something maybe like that a celebrity did, like, oh my gosh, did you hear blah, blah, blah. So kind of thinking ahead about some things to talk about or some things to ask about, like if somebody's taking any sort of classes, they have hobbies, if they're in school, what they're studying, if they have siblings, kind of thinking ahead of time of some of those things that you can ask, and small talk can be really hard. And I'll pause after this to see if there are comments, but vulnerability, this is one that I work with in terms of friendships and romantic relationships with a lot of my clients who I think so many of my clients are so authentic and have such good intentions that sometimes it's hard to imagine that other people don't. And unfortunately, I've seen people get taken advantage of, so kind of wanting to get close to them in order to meet somebody else, or many other reasons, but this involves safety also, and remembering that unfortunately not everybody has the best of intentions. So I always suggest that a first and maybe even second date should be in a public place, that you should tell somebody where you're meeting, that you probably shouldn't like go in the same car and pick someone up on a first date, even though historically that's kind of what dating looked like, but to meet somewhere that's safe so that you're not in a vulnerable spot. You know, let's say you're at a bar, you get a drink, and then you're walking to cars. Make sure that you're walking to a, you know, it's a well-lit place with other people around, or you're grabbing an Uber right outside. Whatever it is that makes you feel safe, texting someone and telling them, hey, I'm getting in the car. Not because most people are unsafe, but just because we never know. And sometimes it is hard to gauge that when we're first meeting somebody.
Well, there's been a lot of chatting going on.
Okay.
He has discussed his wife and kind of the trouble. She's neurotypical, and so some of the problems that they have in their relationship, because she gets upset with him about some of his aspy personality.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah.
And then there are some discussions about frustrations about talking, some issues of pointing out that men, because they're bigger and they're, you know, stronger, that they can be perceived as being creepy just because they've got a physical threat.
Yeah.
About anxiety about talking to girls, about getting shy, and frustration about when you have to own making the conversation happen. So when it comes to conversation or interactions, I hate when I feel I have to do all the work, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe I'll try to address a couple of these. So Andrew's comment about the gender disparity, right? And how unfortunately it kind of puts men on this defense of like, oh, just because they're bigger and taller and stronger. Unfortunately, there's a lot of truth to that comment, right? Fair or not. So I don't know that it's fair, but unfortunately, it can make women more vulnerable, or at least they perceive that they're more vulnerable. And this is where I find some men getting into trouble without realizing that some of these unrelenting behaviors or love fixations are actually scaring women when they're not dangerous people at all. right? But that doesn't change somebody's perception of like being home alone and somebody shows up at their doorstep. So you're absolutely right. I don't know that it's fair, but I think it's true what you're saying. So I hate it when I feel like I have to do all or most of the talking. Yeah, it's hard. So, you know, it's important to ask open-ended questions that give people the opportunity to talk more. Sometimes we get stuck asking yes or no questions that feel kind of like an interview. You know, do you have siblings? Have you been here before? Rather than saying, you know, do you have a favorite restaurant? Or I guess that's not open-ended either, but, you know, what kinds of foods do you usually like to eat? Right? Or what's your family like? Those are a little bit more open-ended, so it kind of gives the opportunity for someone else to carry the conversation too, and to give you a break.
Lindsay,
Yeah,
just another thing about conversation, a few things. One is,
yeah.
you know, what's the goal of the conversation? And it's really to find that connection, to find what you have in common. And I think that's an important, it's not just to ask questions and to keep the conversation going. You're trying to get to know them, and you're trying to find out if you're compatible. So
Yeah, absolutely. So that's true. It's not about collecting information, right? It's not about like, oh, I have to ask all these questions so that I know all this about a person. That's helpful, right? We want to learn about the person, but true, you want to see if you can kind of, if you guys have like can have a little bit of a flow to your conversation where you feel comfortable with each other. You want to see if you have some similarities in your background that gives you a foundation and gives you something more to connect on and more in common. See if there are things you both enjoy doing, so it gives you ideas if you might want to hang out again. Sometimes things will come out in the conversation where you're like, oh, I realize that we're not a fit because of something, you know, something that they mentioned. So it's all a learning process. And that's what's tricky about dating, is it's a process. Each date is more of this process of getting to know someone. And yeah, someone pointed out getting to know if you have chemistry. Exactly. And that's sort of this nebulous, sorry, I'm hearing my son calling for me, so I'm hoping that my husband takes care of him. But yeah, this is sort of this abstract thing. What is chemistry, and what is a spark? Right? And I've heard some people say, oh, there was no spark on my first date with my significant other, and others say, oh, there was a spark the very first time we started talking. There's no rule, unfortunately. Sometimes that chemistry develops over time, but I think what it is a comfort, right? If you feel comfortable with someone enough to hang out with them again, if you find them interesting. I do agree with this comment that I think there's not a lot of emphasis on social skills in school, and it depends on the home, right? I think this is changing a little bit. It's been interesting listening to virtual school for my kids, because I hear what the teachers are doing now, and I'm hearing more and more of this like emotion regulation and social skills in class that's been incorporated. But I think certainly 10 years ago, 20 years ago, yeah, it wasn't an emphasis in school, at least most schools, right? And then appropriate age to be in a relationship with someone, I think that totally varies in terms of when somebody's ready, right? I think that there's societal pressure. I have a lot of clients in high school who are like, oh my gosh, everyone's dating. I'm the only single person in the world. And I don't think that's true. I think a lot of people in high school are not ready to be dating. I think a lot of people in college are just kind of finding their feet in terms of making friends and finding a niche, and maybe they start dating. There's no right age. Some people don't feel comfortable doing that until their 30s, and that's okay too. It's really about what you feel comfortable with and what fits for you. But it is hard if you kind of compare yourself to peers or what you see on TV or on social media, and it gives us a sense of like what normal is, when really I don't think that there is a normal. Okay, so is there anything else glaring in the comments that?
I think there were a couple things that I would mention.
Yeah.
One was really a question about sex and when does that come? You know, like,
Yeah.
should you just be friends for a while and just talk for a while, or how does that work? And I think we're not going to talk a lot about that, but that was one question.
Yeah.
And the other was a comment that September made here that says, it seems as if we need social stories, ideas of where to meet people, how to handle the emotions involved in dating. And yeah,
I
I
love
think,
that. Yeah.
yeah, I like that too.
Yeah. So at the very end of this, and I don't think I included it in the slides, partly because we haven't published it, but my colleague and I sort of came up with like a 10-week, not really social story, but kind of like a small group format to go through each of these things in depth. And we did a pilot group with six, I think there were either 5 or 6 young men. So I'll talk a little bit about that too and some ideas that I have for that.
Sure.
This idea also, I think it is important, and I think I brought it up on a later slide, but of being in a relationship where one person is neurotypical and one is on the spectrum. I actually, more and more, I'm getting referrals for this. I'm not a couples therapist, but I have a couple of couples in my practice because there aren't a lot of therapists who work with adults on the spectrum. And so this is coming up a lot. And it just so happens that the ones that I have in my practice are the men are on the spectrum and the women are not, but obviously that's not always the case. And really, I am going to talk about this more if we have time, because I think I have something in a slide about it. So if I don't come back to that, make another comment, because I think I have a slide on it and we'll talk about it in a few minutes. Okay, some of the other things that you guys know make dating tricky. This lack of predictability that I mentioned, oh my gosh, I wish we had a crystal ball, right? I remember dating being like, some of this angst would go away if I just knew it would turn out like XYZ. Then I could enjoy the process. The process for me was really hard to enjoy because it was so unpredictable. And I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to that. Sensory differences. So this comes up with actual dates, right? So being in places that are sensory, they're aversive for different reasons, thinking through where you might want to meet on a date in case certain smells or sounds are bothersome, or lights. This also comes up with intimacy and sex. And I just realized I didn't address that question. And this has come up with some of my clients too. Not that they don't enjoy sex, but they don't necessarily like touching or the intimacy or the cuddling on the couch while watching TV and not wanting to offend their partner. And I think that's okay. I think it's about communication and getting to a comfort level. And this is about being with a partner that you feel like you can be vulnerable with, and being able to say, sometimes I need my space. It's not a reflection of how I feel about you. It doesn't mean I'm not interested in you. This is just how I work and how my body works. I like to have my space sometimes. And if somebody doesn't accept that, that's not a great match, right? Because there are people who accept that. But the earlier on in a relationship, maybe not the first date, but I mean even early in a marriage, right? But the earlier on that you can clearly communicate, the less you're going to have those problems down the line. And so the couples that I work with, a lot of them, what happened is, because these are older couples, people with more subtle symptoms weren't being diagnosed. They didn't know they were on the spectrum. They didn't know to communicate these things to their partner because they didn't really understand these things about themselves, right? So to be able to say, hey, after I'm at work all day and I'm talking to people, I need to unwind and I need some downtime. It doesn't mean I'm not interested in you. It doesn't mean that I don't respect you, but I actually need some time in a room by myself to decompress. And being able to say that rather than just passively disappearing, and then the partner wondering, what's the deal? Why doesn't he want to talk to me? I feel lonely in this relationship, right? So the more that you guys are doing work to understand yourselves, the more you're going to be able to effectively communicate that to your partner. And it's going to be a good thing, because it leads to less misunderstanding and fewer assumptions, right? When we don't communicate things, we make an assumption. Oh, he went in there because he's annoyed with me. He went in there because he has no interest in me. That's why he's in that room by himself. Rather than, oh, I understand. He needs that buffer. When he comes home from work, he needs time on his own. So, the earlier we know this about ourselves, the better and earlier we can communicate this to partners. So that's a little bit about the question about sex, but not completely. As far as the right time to have sex in a relationship? I honestly believe that totally varies. That varies by religion, by culture, by, you know, generation, right? This is just totally different depending on who you talk to. Some people are very comfortable with sex early on and some are not. I think the key is that all of those things are okay. If you want to wait until marriage to have sex, that's okay. You don't need to, you know, sort of acquiesce to societal pressure. It's about being on the same page with your partner and being able to express to them what you're comfortable with and not doing things that you're not comfortable with. Rejection can be hard for anyone. And as I mentioned, this came up in the group, the pilot group that we did with actually one of the young men who was dealing with someone who had changed their minds about sexual intimacy in the middle of you know, being intimate. And he was very, I have to say, quite like rigid about, no, she had said yes, so this is what we're going to do. And hard to accept the fact that other people change their minds, right? Someone might be really interested and enthusiastic about a second date, and then after the second date they're not so much, and people change their mind, and you have to kind of go into it knowing that it's not predictable and that those things can happen. Differences in emotional expression. So I find this actually in marriages and couples a lot. Oftentimes, you know, one person in the relationship saying, I don't know how he feels, or I don't know how she feels. She's never expressing it. She's never talking about it. That doesn't mean they're not feeling it, right? And so you don't have to match the person in terms of how you express emotions. But again, knowing this about yourself and being able to communicate that and say, hey, I don't always say how I feel in the moment, or I'm not necessarily really effusive. It doesn't mean I'm not feeling something really intense, and here's how I can let you know how I feel. Okay, I saw the comments building up again.
Yeah, it's mostly about a situation.
Okay.
One of our members is divorced, and kind of what happened there. In that his wife really didn't want to understand what he, you know, about himself. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's hard, especially after a history of a certain patterns, right?
Right, and then
Yeah.
Steve, who seems to have a good relationship with his wife, mentions that she has other friends and spends time with them, which is really, I'm going to just personally say, is really important. That you said, you know, you mentioned earlier that it's great to have your person, but it's also important to give each other some space and have other interest in people that.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought that up. And that's something that I often, and again, this is a gender stereotype that does not always hold true, but I have found that I'm often talking to women about this, saying, maybe you have, you know, Brenda, who you vent to about work stuff, and maybe you have so-and-so who you vent to about this. Maybe you have so-and-so who you joke around about this, and maybe having the expectation that your partner fulfills all of those needs is too much, right? So I agree with that it's important once you're in a relationship to make sure that sometimes both people don't need that, but usually at least one person does.
I think Karen points out an interesting situation she had where she doesn't use pet names and she got criticized by the person she was with. And I think there's actually probably two parts of it about using pet names or not. I don't think that's important. I think what's important is being criticized and how, because you've got this relationship and how you're able to work through that criticism, because criticism can come up and you're going to need to work through difficulties. Or maybe that's just not the right person for you, but you got to decide, is this a bad thing that can be worked through, or is this just not the right person?
Yeah.
But I'll let you comment on that too.
Yeah, that's so funny, and not funny, but this is sort of a personal thing I'll share. My husband and I don't do pet names either. And every time we hear like, oh, babe this, babe that, we don't do that. We just call each other by our names. So I totally get that. I just want to say that it's okay not to use pet names. But right, the criticism part, I agree with Judy. That's the part that's important, right? It's about being on the same page. And if you're criticized for something that you don't feel comfortable with pet names, or you don't like pet names, or they bother you or whatever, that's fine, right? It's the fact that you don't want to be with someone that criticizes you for that, and I guess that shows that you're on different pages about something that's
It,
maybe for some reason important to that person.
but I think there's two parts to that. One, it's easy to give up on things quickly, and you
Mm-hmm.
need to decide. And it could be their sense of humor. They could be just kidding you, and you may be misunderstanding. So I
True.
think I think especially like the first year of marriage, there's always all sorts of misunderstandings and miscommunications and stuff. And I think one of the things that you're going to need to learn in a relationship is the ability to be more assertive and speak for yourself and be able to work through problems, because relationships aren't perfect. It's not like you find the perfect person and then everything's perfect. There are challenges in life, and so being able to work through them is really important.
I think that that's absolutely true. And another thing, as therapists, we're always trained to ask ourselves, what's the question behind the question? What that means is, why is somebody really asking this, or why is somebody really concerned about this? And that example of like the pet names, I guess, to Judy's point about not giving up easily, that also might be an aspect where you ask, why is that so important? Right? Like, why is that something that you value so much that you're criticizing me for it? And maybe you have different values about that and you go your separate ways. Maybe that's an opportunity to have a conversation to really learn why that's so important to the person.
Yeah, there's some interesting comments here about,
Mhm.
I guess, exclusivity in a sense, staying faithful and positive when with your
Yeah.
spouse. So during the issue of exclusivity and
Yeah. So I guess everybody has different rules for this. I mean, culturally, I would say there's a general understanding that when you are married, when you have a spouse, that you're faithful. Now, if you have an agreement within your marriage that's not the case, then that's different. But as far as being faithful while dating, I think that depends on the stage of dating. And this is something that some people find easier than others. I think in the very beginning stages, when you're just going on one date or two date, it's acceptable and probably assumed that you're going on one date, two dates with other people too, and not necessarily, faithful. I don't know exactly what that means. That could be, having sex. That could be going on dates. But the farther along that you get in a relationship, the more appropriate it is to have that conversation, especially if you want to have safe sex. If you feel like having sex makes you emotionally vulnerable and you want to make sure that you're the only person that person is doing that with. So again, a lot of that has to do with some of these awkward conversations and having to ask the question and make sure you're on the same page. I know that there were some questions about women and men and relationships. So yeah, I think sort of an old school assumption is that men initiate and make a first move, but that certainly don't think that's always the case. So, I definitely know of relationships where that wasn't the case. Yeah, I don't want to go too much into that because I don't feel like I'm an expert in it. But I think that different people want different things. There are some men that might actually not want somebody to initiate, right? It depends. But I think that it certainly happened both ways. Okay, anything else in there that,
I'm trying. There's one real long one. Oh, okay. It's about a mother whose daughter is actively seeking a boyfriend, but let's see. So she's not really ready for a relationship.
mhm. Yeah, and that is tricky when parents feel like, oh, they're not quite ready, but they're seeking it out anyway. Um, Yeah, and that question is hard to answer without knowing specifics, like if the person lives at home, how old they are, all of those things. Yeah, so I don't want to get too much into that.
Yeah,
Uh, but
it's
yeah,
complicated.
age isn't always equivalent with readiness, right? So it is tricky. Okay. So
Why don't you keep going?
yeah, there was a great question, actually, a common issue. It's very difficult to tell or sense if someone is just being nice and friendly or is actually interested in us. And that is totally true. That's really hard. And so part of that, when I get into sort of asking someone on a date and some of those tips, maybe we'll address some of that too, and being able to gauge someone else's intentions. Okay. I just liked this quote. I'm going to move this away. That when we look at the data and see low rates of relationships, I think it's important to remember a quote like this. It's not that they don't feel strong emotions such as love and attraction, but rather that they're not quite sure how to express it. And when it's appropriate to do so. So, right, so this idea that like, you can't just look at the data and say, oh, many people are not in relationships, they must not want to. Or, in this relationship, the man doesn't emote very much. And so the woman feels like he doesn't love her. And in fact, that's very often not true, right? But that the way that he's expressing that is different than what she might expect or how she expresses things. Okay, so this is the slide I was talking about where I had kind of, this is based on just my experience, but not necessarily on research. And I'll give the caveat that I'm making some assumptions here based on the people that I've seen. So this is not necessarily true for everybody. I have found though in my experience when I've worked with couples where there's like one neurotypical, one on the spectrum, oftentimes the neurotypical partner is drawn to this idea of stability, like meeting someone who's even keel and doesn't have a lot of drama. They say what they mean what they say, and they really like that. But then maybe later on, sort of noting that they wish that there was a little bit more effusiveness to that. And that people on the spectrum may actually attract people who are more effusive because to them, like, getting all of that emotion, it's more clear how they feel too. I found that many partners are saying they want more affection and sharing of emotion. So again, that comes back to being very clear and being able to communicate your needs and what your comfort level is. I've met a few partners who have talked about feeling lonely and wanting more in a partnership. I will say I think this is from a history, like decades of marriage, of not knowing maybe that the person is on the spectrum. They didn't know it themselves, and not being able to work on communicating this to each other. So there becomes this big divide when one person needs that alone time, one person needs to recharge, one person isn't as likely to emote and talk about how much they love the person, and not knowing to communicate that and say, hey, this is maybe my nature. It's not a reflection of how I feel about you. So years and years of that, when there's a pattern of that, that's when I see some of this loneliness emerge. I also see, and this is down the line in relationships, like I'm thinking more about marriage. I often see one partner, like the neurotypical partner, wants to have conversations to collaborate. Hey, let's talk this through. Let's work on this. And oftentimes, and this is a gender stereotype as well, oftentimes the man or the person on the spectrum is like, well, let's problem solve. Let's get to the answer. And there's a difference in communication styles there that gets in the way. But I also see these just wonderful qualities of, when I do work with couples, of these really committed, devoted partners who are very honest, very trustworthy. And just, it's quite moving actually to hear some of them talk about their wives and their dedication to the relationship. And in this case, it has been wives that they're dedicated to. Again, that's just my limited experience in the partners I've seen. And again, the need for communication, to be able to really communicate what your needs are in the relationship. Someone was asking, I saw, about websites for dating on the spectrum. I would love to know if anyone has actual experience with this. I've read a lot about it, and I don't know how successful it is, if people have actually tried this. And of course there's Match and Tinder and all these other sites, but I think this one's developed specifically for people on the spectrum. How many of you guys have thought about this? Self-disclosure in dating. Do you tell somebody if you're on the autism spectrum? And this was a quote from somebody, it feels like a catch-22. If you tell them straight away, it might scare them off, but then if you wait, it looks as if you've been hiding something. I want people to know I have a condition, but also to get to know me as a person, right? And not to think that that's the first thing that they know about you. So this is something, you know, if we had a lot of time for discussion, I would love your thoughts on this. I think it differs depending on the person, depending on the relationship. I say maybe not the first date if you're not comfortable, but at some point early on, so it doesn't feel like this thing that's weighing on you or some secret, right? That if this is a big part of your identity, that you would want that person to know. That's not always the case. That doesn't fit for everyone, but that's kind of my, you know, my initial thoughts about it. I'm just reading a couple comments. Yeah, so one of the things that, oh, someone said that Hickey didn't work for them. It was a buggy app. Interesting, okay. Yeah, oh, someone was asking what effusive meant. Yeah, so effusive is like, sometimes I see that people on the spectrum, at least the married ones that I've worked with, are often drawn to women who are much more, their emotions are very apparent, right? Very expressive, sharing how they feel, big facial expressions, that sort of thing. Okay. So, yeah, I feel tempted to disclose. They can, oh, so they can go easy on me. Yeah, so that they kind of understand the context. I think that, yeah, I think that that makes sense, right? So maybe to fully understand. One of the issues I know that I run into, even talking to parents, and maybe you guys run into too, is that there are some misconceptions about autism. And I think as time goes on and the general public has a better understanding of the broad spectrum, that this gets better. But I know that the word autism carries a lot of weight. And so disclosing that can feel like a big deal, even though we know that this is a variation in humans, right? In our brains. And so just like a neurotypical person has their own variations. So, but there is a lot of misconception and misunderstanding around autism. And I think that sometimes that stops people from disclosing early on, which is understandable. This is, there's a lot of words in this post, but I posted this because a couple of times, this is an old picture, but I was pregnant in this picture actually, but but this is the colleague that I was telling you about, Dr. Whittam, who did her dissertation on speed dating and autism. And she's a wonderful clinician. She's in the Bay Area now. And so after she did her dissertation and we worked together on it, we were asked to write a couple of blog posts for Autism Speaks, which I know Autism Speaks, there are mixed feelings about Autism Speaks, but I liked the blog post. And we developed this sort of like intervention that I'll just briefly tell you about too. We've already talked about some of this, so I'm going to breeze through. This is basically what's on the website. So we talked a bit about what we call love fixations. We talked about some of the pluses and minuses of online dating that I've already mentioned, and this idea of how sensory differences can interfere, and to be thoughtful about that when it comes to planning dates. We talked in this blog about rejection and how rejection is just the worst for everyone. And it's often confusing. I think what's hard about dating is we don't always get an explanation, right? Sometimes we're ghosted, like I saw on the comments, and we don't know why. It happened to me. I hope I didn't do it to other people, but I think it's really common in online dating. So this is really hard, and it's sort of like going into dating knowing that until you find your person, it's all rejection, right? Like every relationship ends until you find that one that works. And so to expect that that's part of the process. We talked about reading and sending signals, and how in dating, we didn't talk a lot about this, but it can be really subtle And so that makes it even harder. It's so confusing. And really for you guys to note that this presents challenges for many people. But of course, there are some extra complexities that go along with ASD. This can be confusing, right? If you feel like you've missed cues, if you feel like the other person has missed cues. So this takes some extra attention, which I'm sure you're already doing, but it's also okay to clarify, right? So if you're not sure, it's okay to clarify, like, what did you mean by that? Or to ask how they're doing during the date. How are you doing? Do you need to get going? Are you, especially if they're looking around, if they're looking at their phone and you're not sure what that means, it's okay. And a lot of people kind of find it endearing, actually, to be open like that, to say like, oh, I'm not sure what you meant by that. Did you mean XYZ? It's okay to do that sometimes if you're really not sure. It's better than guessing in a lot of these situations. Okay, so these are the 10 tips that are on the blog. So I'm just going to review them because I talked briefly about some of these already. Like I mentioned, when it comes to asking someone out, ask in private. This also goes for online chats, right? So I know sometimes people are in a chat group with like 4 people. You want to do this where there aren't a lot of people around if you're asking someone on a date. Sorry, after a long day of telehealth and virtual school with my kids and this, I'm losing my voice. Ask open-ended questions, and that even goes for asking someone out. So what I mean by that is if you say to someone, do you want to see the new Star Wars movie on, Saturday at 4? This is when movie theaters were open, right? There's a lot of things that person can say no to. They might not like Star Wars. They might not be around on Saturday. They might have plans with their family at 4 o'clock. So when it comes to asking someone out, you might want to say something like, do you want to hang out sometime? Or let's say you guys are talking about ice cream. Like, we should try that new place sometime. Or, oh, you like those movies? It would be great to see the next one with you at some point, right? And then if the person says, oh my gosh, yeah, then you can get more specific and say something like, oh, maybe we can do it on a Saturday. Are you usually around, or are you working on Saturdays? Right? You can get more and more specific, but it's kind of nice to gauge it with something a little bit broader. So not necessarily open-ended, but also just kind of broader to gauge the interest. I even talk about this with kids when it comes to play dates and get-togethers. Instead of saying, do you want to come to my house Tuesday at 3? Right, to say like, you should come over sometime, or would you want to hang out sometime and talk about this? Picking the right place, again, consider if it's a place that you're comfortable at, consider the distance, like if you get a sense of where the other person lives, you want to make it somewhat convenient for you and for them. This, we came up with these tips before COVID. So now dating looks a little different. Sometimes it means grabbing a coffee and walking and sitting far apart on a picnic blanket at a park, right? So this is going to look a little different than it did pre-COVID. Hopefully that's temporary. And we talked about going with the flow, which is so much easier said than done, I will acknowledge, but to expect unpredictability. I'm just going to check in on the comments to see if there's...
Yeah, I think just to comment on what an open questions are.
Yeah, absolutely. So open-ended questions are questions that are not yes/no questions. So if something is not open-ended, there's too much opportunity for someone to just shut it down, right? So a non-open-ended question would be, do you like Star Wars movies? The person says no. And you're like, oh, okay, so you have to kind of like start over, right? An open-ended question would be, what kind of movies do you like? Open-ended gives the person a chance to elaborate and to explain for themselves. So you're not just giving a yes/no option. So it kind of lends itself to opening the door to conversation, to getting a sense of their interest and to gauging their interest level. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Yeah, and in the pandemic that people have resorted to Zoom or Skype dates. Yeah, so I don't know how you guys feel about that. I think in some ways it could be more pressure, because I think that dates are great when there's an activity. So there isn't all this pressure of conversation. And on Zoom, there's certainly more pressure, or Skype, for that intense interaction. So, you know, I haven't had personal experience with that, obviously, but that's something that I would wonder if there's a way to kind of do an activity over Zoom, or make it so that there's less reliance on that pressure, or making a time frame saying, yeah, I can talk, but I have something at 3:30, so that you have an out if you need to. Again, this idea of keeping it short, or even kind of doing something cute, like saying, yeah, let's both make coffee and then meet for coffee on Zoom. So there's at least kind of like a prop or something. I always think with dates, it's easier when there's a prop, it's easier when there's an activity, so there's something else to focus on. You can be like, how is your coffee? What kind of coffee do you drink? Where do you usually get coffee? You know, it kind of gives you that topic built in when there's something like that.
I just wanted to let you know, because the time is flying by, that it's about 8:40 something.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll kind of go through these next few slides without stopping on the comments. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. Unless there's something pressing, let me know. So we talked a bit about being open to dating more than one person. Be honest, you know, be yourself, because it takes too much energy to try to not be, and it's going to come out at some point anyway. I talked about asking questions about the other person, about their interests. Show that you're interested in getting to know them. You know, I mentioned thinking of some topics ahead of time. Be careful not to look at your phone. I mentioned activities that could make the conversation a little bit less exhausting, so that you're not just, you know, having that pressure to talk the whole time. It can be tricky not to focus on your phone, but you definitely want to put that aside during a date. Make good eye contact. You know, this is of course, right? We always talk about eye contact. Use your tricks, right? So if you're the kind of person that likes to look away, but then check in with eye contact, and that's okay too, right? You want to show that you're interested. If eye contact is really uncomfortable for you and the tricks are not working, right? Like looking right here or checking in, let them know at some point, like, hey, even if I'm not looking at you, I'm totally listening, you know, and maybe later saying it's just not really comfortable for me to do that. Be aware of your body language. So you've probably paid a lot of attention to this, but you want to make sure your body is facing the person, if there's room where you guys are. If you're out on a social distance date, same thing. You know, crossing arms might make you feel more comfortable, but it's usually perceived as being kind of closed off. You want to nod, show that you're listening, even if you're overwhelmed and anxious or nervous about the date. By smiling and nodding, it kind of encourages the other person to keep talking, and it shows that you're interested. Check for clues about intimacy. This is hard in the age of COVID, but when it's not COVID, this is someone leaning forward. This is someone kind of periodically touching you. If you're walking, they might kind of bump into you. Those are clues that they're trying to get closer in some way. Number 9 might seem somewhat obvious, right? Personal hygiene, clean clothing. When we did this like 10-week dating group that I mentioned, this actually came up a bit. There was, you know, sometimes there was one young man who would like raise his arms and his shirt would go up, or he realized his shirt had stains on it, right? And again, you want to dress and be you. You want it to be a reflection of you, but you also want to put your best foot forward like you would on a job interview. Not that you would wear a suit, you know, on a date, but kind of showing your best self and that you take care of yourself. And I talked about safety already, meeting at a public place, letting somebody know where you are. Really briefly, when we talk about relationship intervention, it's not really intervention, I would call it support. And I think that this deals with sex ed and helping parents really know how to talk to their kids about this from an early age, especially with respect to sexual development. Again, there are the same health consequences and safety consequences. And there's actually evidence that a lot of people on the spectrum are learning about this, like by Googling or from other people rather than from parents, because parents might have fear about talking about that early on for a variety of reasons, or discomfort, or feeling like their child's not ready. So this is just the last part that I wanted to tell you guys about that Dr. Whittam and I had developed. We went through these 10 weeks with this pilot group when we were both at UCLA, and we have not really gotten it off the ground since she moved away and I went to another university. But this is where we flushed things out. I don't know that it was really social stories, but we had videos, we acted things out, we talked through different dating scenarios, we rehearsed, and we went through all of these different topics, and also gave the opportunity to talk about what had gone wrong for people on dates and maybe how to address that moving forward. So, because if you guys, as you have pointed out, it's not just about talking about this for 1 or 2 hours, right? But that this is a complicated topic, and we really respect that too. And so this was fun and I think informative for us too.
How did it work, Lindsay? I mean, did you feel, you said there was, what, a half dozen or so people?
Yeah, there were 5 or 6, and it was interesting. So we found that mothers of girls, of young women, didn't want them in the group, and we realized we would have to do a separate women's group, understandably. So it was all men. It was tricky. It was tricky, and we learned a lot. There was, for example, you know, with 5 or 6 men in a room, they're going to have different viewpoints on dating and intimacy and all of those things. And one, for example, had very strong opinions and thoughts about sex and was very open about sharing that. It made one of the men uncomfortable. And so he wanted to join on Zoom and not be in the room. These are very touchy subjects, right? Things came up about stalking, about the law, about respecting when somebody doesn't want to be intimate. These are really sensitive topics, and I think they're important for everyone, not just someone on the spectrum. But I think it was helpful for Sienna and I to kind of see that play out in real life. It was also fun. We went through some like examples of bad dates and why they were bad and what was awkward about them, and really went through, like, I'll actually show you guys. This was one of our, I'm blanking, yeah, our agenda for the day. So we had like a leader agenda and a client agenda, and we would go through all of these different, really like teasing apart these details, right? How to tell if somebody's interested. For example, going through different types of nonverbal communication, examples, playing them out, kind of like doing them with each other and testing them out. Sometimes real life stuff came up. So for example, we had pizza delivered each time we had one of these groups. And Sienna and I kind of joked at first, because we were the only women there, that by the time we would go to get a piece, all the pizza was gone, because everyone loves pizza, right? And so like the pizza would come and all the guys would like grab the pizza and eat it. And examples like that gave us the opportunity to say, actually, what would you do if you were on a date, right? And there were chips and salsa on the table. How we should actually make sure before you take the last slice or the last chip and ask if somebody wants it. So it kind of lended itself to some of these scenarios that we hadn't really thought of when we made the manual too. And then we went through, we actually really tried to map out and try to do what we could to make dating a little bit more, less abstract, right? So abstract, yeah. So to actually go through like decision trees like this and to help guide people through dating. I wish I had this when I was dating. I mean, honestly, I find dating just really complicated. So, so we got good feedback from it. It was more logistics that we couldn't really keep it going. And this is totally, oh yeah, I was gonna give you guys anecdotes. So I wanted to tell you guys too, I wrote a book. I actually get no royalties from this book, as crazy as it sounds, so no pressure. But I did want to tell you guys, about it. It's a social survival guide that I was asked to write for teens. I think it applies to adults too, hopefully, but it's not just about social skills and breaking down all the social skills. It's also about attending to emotions, right? And I think for me and a lot of my clinical experience, it's the emotional piece that sometimes interferes. Like we can learn the skills, but it's our assumptions, it's our anxiety, it's all of those things that interfere. So we tried to address that in this book too. So it goes on sale in a few weeks, and I've been asked to promote it for the publishing company. But anyway, it'll be out there in the next few weeks. So I don't know, I'll leave it on future directions in case anybody wants to read it, because I know we're about out of time. And I'll see if are there any other specific questions. Off and make sure my husband handled my kids okay. But I wanted to thank you guys too for being such a great audience. And I know these are sensitive topics too, and you guys were supportive to me when I'm trying to learn all this too. So thank you guys. I hope everyone has a good night and stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.